Great. Thank you so much. I'm so excited to be here and thankful to see you all. Um, so yeah, I'm Sarah. I come from economics, and so this is actually my first time presenting this work to a much more interdisciplinary group. So I'm really especially excited to hear what everybody here has to say about this. But this work really, oh, and about the paper, I'm happy to, if you don't have access to the Feminist Economics Journal, please feel free to send me an email. I'm happy to share the published paper version of this if that's useful to you. But anyway, this paper really came from thinking about a few things. One is this quote from Joyce Jacobson, which is published in this new handbook on feminist economics, where she says that the quantitative methods in economics are really barely discernible from what feminist economists use. And she says really the techniques that they use to carry out their analysis are not any different from kind of the mainstream economists who historically feminist economists kind of criticized in terms of their methodology, right? There's a big push in kind of the origins of feminist economics, especially in the 90s, to take on more qualitative work, but also to think more seriously about quantitative data, which don't capture a lot of issues like care work, for instance. And we know economics broadly as a field is becoming increasingly focused on causal inference and quantitative methods, less focused on things like theory and qualitative work. And we see that also mimicked in feminist economics. This is a figure from a paper that I published with Alyssa Bronstein, where we were looking at the methods that are employed in the journal over the last several decades of the journal's life. We see it's become much more empirical, and including empirical, right, quantitative and qualitative, but also much more quantitative compared to earlier years of the journal's life. And so, again, for me, this raises a lot of questions as someone who's really committed to what feminist economics stands for, which includes broadly, right, challenging the kind of masculine bias that we see in economics, embracing methodological plurality, trying to combat this, I think, physics envy thing that we see in economics, where there's a bit of posturing about I mean, it's positivist posturing that we see in so many quantitative approaches, where, because there's numbers or quantitative methods or statistics, a lot of folks, present this as purely logical and objective and scientific. But we know, right, as feminists, that doesn't mean just because one is using quantitative data that the study might be free from bias, right? There's still all kinds of subjectivity that comes into play. And so I also want to highlight this is not something that's like distinct to feminist economics within the economics discipline. Again, most of the discipline is really kind of focused on causal inference and quantitative methods. But I also want to highlight, for instance, economic historians who have also kind of sided with feminist economists on this front. This is a quote from Trayvon Logan, who points specifically to the fact that we have to rely on qualitative evidence to understand African American economic history in particular. But right, really kind of this emphasis on how the quantitative approaches might limit the scope of questions that we can ask. So there's been a lot of work on this, as I'm kind of alluding to, in terms of, right, should economics be focused on, the qualitative or the quantitative? My goals with this paper are not to, I'm going to be focused on quantitative methods, but I don't want you to leave thinking that I'm trying to defend quantitative methods over qualitative. I also am not going to talk at all really about like primary data collection. There's a lot of really great work in feminist economics on this. One of my favorites is Naila Kabir's work, where she's really criticizing randomized control trials. I think there's been plenty of research on like what feminist economics research topics should be. I often think of feminist economics as distinct from like a more mainstream gender economics in that it focuses on power, patriarchy, and social provisioning rather than just like gender difference. And I also don't want to like rehash general recommendations on feminist research methods kind of broadly. There's this paper from Marlene Kim, again, within kind of the scope of feminist economics that I quite like for that. So instead, my goals with this paper are rather to offer some guidelines on like what could be a distinctly feminist approach to econometrics. And I'm really like I don't really know the answers to a lot of the questions I might be posing, which is why I'm optimistic that maybe this is more a conversation starter than anything else. You might disagree with some of the things I say, and I would love that, and I would love to see more writing on it. Um, uh, but I think it's important that we really think critically about the methods that we're using, particularly as kind of feminists. So I'll start with the beginning, where a lot of quantitative researchers begin, which is in data cleaning. We know as researchers that we spend so much of our time cleaning and preparing secondary data, around 80% of the time, in fact, according to some studies. I think it's important that maybe we become a little more transparent about our cleaning and data decisions, particularly from feminist perspectives. Right, we could talk about Kevin Guyan's book, which I'll refer to again later, but he talks about kind of lumpers and splitters. How do you decide, for instance, if you're going to lump a certain category of people together? In the kind of the US context, for instance, you might see a lot of folks lumping together BIPOC, which is Black, Indigenous, people of color. Does it make sense, right, to lump those groups together, right, theoretically or based on their experiences, or is it perhaps not a great approach? But if you split things up too much, some categories might get too small to be particularly meaningful, right? So I think kind of having conversations about that more explicitly in our work might be helpful. Similarly, if a lot of us are working on kind of intersectional approaches and really honing in on specific groups, it might be useful to think really critically about like the survey weights that we're using and if those survey weights make sense. There's a really great paper by Carpenter and others in 2022 where they were using household pulse survey data to talk about kind of the economic experiences of trans folks during the COVID pandemic. They talked about kind of they had I think a really nice conversation in the paper about their lumping and splitting choices, but they also had some acknowledgement about the weights and how maybe the weights didn't make very much sense for the population that they were focused on. So I point to that as one of my favorite examples. This is Kevin Guyan's book that I was referencing earlier called Queer Data. I really like it. There's a few books in the presentation that I'll just shout out because I like them. But Guyan really talks about how even data cleaning itself might not really make sense, right? For a lot of, for instance, LGBTQ people, there's kind of an intentionality in selecting the wrong answer, or kind of writing in something different, right? And data cleaning really kind of misses that and clumps it into more heteronormative assumptions. So I think that's also worth talking about when we're cleaning some of our data. And I think kind of the last point on like cleaning data and being more deliberate about that in our writing of our research is also about replicability. And I think this is really important actually when we start thinking about those feminist points that we all make about right, how quantitative data are not necessarily objective, right, and how quantitative studies are not necessarily free from bias. And so I think having more transparency and opportunity for replicating our own work kind of allows for a more rich interrogation of some of those biases and choices that we all make. Another thing I'll kind of touch on here is just measuring gender in quantitative data, which I'm sure many of us have kind of thought about as maybe something that you're struggling with. Again, particularly in like secondary data, I'm thinking, for instance, of like US Census data and how it's really tricky, right? Because at least in those types of surveys and in many others, we don't get to observe kind of the difference between sex and gender of our respondents. We know these are not necessarily the same things, right? But if one is only offered an opportunity to select male, female, well, what would it mean then if, I'm doing a study, for instance, on education, and I said something like, our study finds females are more likely to complete degrees. Is that really correct, right? Like if we're saying, kind of that word is that the females, right, is that kind of more in reference to biological sex. And as an economist, as a social scientist, I probably don't really have any business talking about that, right? I'm not a biologist. And so I think kind of clearly articulating the limitations of our data in that way might be useful. I also, when I was doing my literature review for this paper, I came across a 2005 piece in this Out of the Margin book called Toward a Feminist Econometrics, in which Redmount is really proposing a model of endogenous gender, where gender is something that's not necessarily a binary, but rather like a continuous variable and is determined endogenously, so like within the model or within the economic structure. I think we hadn't really seen all that much of that in terms of kind of advances in econometrics. However, I do want to point out some papers that I think are doing really cool things, though they still have some limitations. But some work by Byrne and Martel, I'll specifically reference them, as well as Nguyen, are really relying on approaches from psychology to do this gender diagnostic approach. I'll just kind of read what they describe their methods as here, because I think it's a nice succinct way to explain it. But basically, they say, okay, the crux of the measure that they're thinking about in terms of gender is that they're utilizing survey responses to measure how similar a respondent's answer are to their same-sex peers. So to measure this, the gender diagnostic methods use a logit regression, where a binary indicator of sex is regressed on survey responses to predict the probability a respondent is male or female. These predicted probabilities are then used as a measure of gender conformity, essentially, because individuals with high predicted values behave in ways more typical of their sex. So again, like here we're kind of thinking about, okay, like regardless of a participant's reported sex, we're thinking about their behaviors a little bit more seriously rather than just kind of this binary measure. I think what's cool about this approach is that it allows for some kind of situational fluidity. So thinking about how one might express their gender or gendered behaviors at home versus at work. I think some of the weaknesses, though, and this is something Nguyen points out in his work, is that it kind of assumes this like stable and coherent and, of course, relatively homogeneous gender norms exist, and it's still really relying on this kind of like binary approach, even if allowing for a little bit more fluidity. So I think it's still worth kind of pointing out as a potential, right, to kind of answer Redmount's initial call, but there's still maybe some work to be done there. Okay, I want to turn now to just regression modeling and design. Here's another one of my my favorite books that I'll shout out. And one thing that I really took away when reading this book was about just feminist research broadly, thinking about like studying up. So focusing on kind of elites and social institutions and power structures and their kind of role in oppression, rather than focusing on or kind of perpetuating notions that like oppressed individuals themselves are the problem or are having some type of like deficiencies. Right. So instead shining a light up, right, in terms of the power structure. And when I was thinking about this in terms of regression modeling and econometrics, one thing I was thinking about was, well, really often when we're trying to compare different groups, for instance, we might often kind of place men or white individuals as the comparison group in our model, right? So if you're thinking about, like binary variables again, for instance, having white men, for instance, equal to 0, this might really draw attention to like again the problems of the oppressed category of individuals rather than the privileges of those who are in like relationships of dominance over them. I think some good examples of work that maybe doesn't do that is Dania Francis has some really great work on Black girls and education in the US. In her 2012 paper, in her models, she sets Black girls as the comparison group, which really I think nicely forces the reader to interpret her econometric model um, by really thinking about kind of the unfair advantages that white girls, in this case, right, the group that she's kind of comparing, um, right, you have to interpret the model by thinking about the unfair advantages that white girls might be accruing rather than the disadvantages that Black girls are facing in American schooling. So I think that's just kind of a nice, simple example. Many of us, I'm sure, have read McCall's work where she really talks about different types of approaches to understanding intersectionality in research. I think a lot of economists in particular, or maybe even folks who are doing a lot of quantitative work broadly, are thinking about this intercategorical complexity. So, right, kind of forcing us to provisionally adopt existing categories to document relationships of inequality among social groups, um, and changing configurations of equality among multiple and conflicting dimensions. Um, so if this is indeed what we're doing, right, we want to think very seriously about how we're doing it in our regression models and econometrics. Um, One thing that I was kind of thinking about, and I know others have thought about this, I'm curious to hear what you have to say, but thinking about right, intersectionality, we know as right, a kind of theory where we're thinking about how modes of oppression are not necessarily like additive. And so it doesn't really make sense to model this in like a linear relationship. Um, so one way I was thinking about this was, okay, well, first, maybe it makes sense to, instead of, including a interaction term, like if you want to focus on Black women, for instance, in a model that includes, right, like white women and men and, right, the kind of a broader sample. So maybe instead of including an interaction term, maybe we should actually think about a separate models approach where we're kind of separating these groups of interest. The reason I was thinking about this was because it might be nice to allow, for instance, the covariates to also vary, right? Like if you're looking at something to do with income, for instance, we know that the effective education for Black women might be really different than the effective education for white women. So to kind of force that covariate to be the same across those models with just, if you were to just have an interaction term, is maybe not as useful as we'd like and maybe not aligned with kind of intersectionality theory. But it also allows us to think about how well does my model work across these different groups? Can we think about the model's explanatory power across these groups and how it might be different? Here's another book that I'll shout out. But in here, there's a great chapter on using confirmatory factor analysis to kind of think about multi-group analysis and think about how maybe it's not appropriate, for instance, to use the same measurement instrument for people in different groups. I also just saw Wendy hop onto the call. Hi, Wendy. I think she's someone who's been doing a lot of really great thinking about kind of intersectional methods and quantitative work, and she's done some really great work talking, for instance, about using classification and regression trees as a particular technique that might help us again think about this like non-linearity of kind of like an intersectional lens on whatever you're studying. So I'll plug her work here too. Um, so kind of in addition to these questions of like intersectionality and how we should set up our models, I think economists have been really, really into causal inference, in particular of late in the last maybe decade or so. And I think that in many ways, this has actually caused a lot of harm and led to a lot of studies that are just not great, right? And I tried in this paper not to pull in too many negative examples because I didn't want to like pick on people. But here I pull in two that I think are useful. Here I was thinking specifically about instrumental variable approaches. In this first study, right, this is a model where the authors are trying to estimate the impact of fertility on women's labor force participation. And they use this like society's sun preference as the instrument and claim that it's exogenous to fertility, endogenous to fertility, but completely exogenous to labor force participation. which how could it be exogenous to labor force participation, right? Sun preference, as we know, is oftentimes associated with right, the fact that, when boys become men, they might be more likely to have higher earnings, for instance. There's another paper that I reference where they're trying to estimate video game usage by women and then kind of make an argument that that's causally related to their pursuit of STEM degrees later on. They use ownership of a microwave as kind of, again, the instrument where they're saying, okay, that's correlated with video game ownership, but not academic performance. And I don't think that that necessarily captures actually the mechanism that they're really interested in, right? You can't simply say that this is causal now, right? There's no measure for things like gender norms in the household that really might be related to things like video game use as well as STEM pursuit. So I think, again, I'm trying not to like pick on pick on folks too much, but I like these examples as kind of a cautionary tale for kind of going around and trying to find and claim causality. Some other, I think, useful critiques that we've seen of several econometric models come from the Oaxaca blinder decomposition critiques literature. There's been a lot of work on this, so I don't spend too much time talking about it in the paper. But one of the big criticisms is that these Oaxaca blinder decomposition techniques, which are often used to figure out, for instance, like wage gap decomposition, they oftentimes underestimate issues of pre-labor market discrimination. So, for instance, in education, and really make it kind of difficult to distinguish between different occupational distributions from differences in individual level characteristics. There's also, right, some kind of more technical critiques, of course, right? So, for instance, that the regression estimates are really quite sensitive to whether the kind of disadvantaged group in the study is a numerical minority or majority in the sample. And again, right, this question of linearity, right? These models don't allow for relationships between characteristics and wage to be nonlinear. So again, there's a pretty big literature on those, but I think it would be remiss to not point that out. Some other concerns about particular approaches that I have from a feminist perspective are also related to a lot of methods that are a little more like black boxy in nature, where we don't really have a great sense of what's going on in there and as a reader, right? So one of those is that I was thinking about was principal component analysis. And oftentimes I think once indices are derived from a principal component analysis, and these are actually really often used for kind of like socioeconomic indices, right? But they often kind of plug these indices into a regression model from a principal component analysis, and it becomes really difficult to pin down precise factors that are contributing to a given relationship. And they also, right, this 2003 piece, right, from McKinsey notes that principal component analyses, which aim to create indices capturing, again, this like socioeconomic status measure, often obscure really important components because the variables that are more unequally distributed between individuals or households in the sample are given more weight. So again, like I think sometimes these are a bit misused. And I think all of all three of these examples, right, kind of the obsession with causal inference, the principal component analysis, and the Oaxaca blinder, I think like in some ways kind of come back to this obsession within economics of like proving one's technical mastery and having this kind of high level of technical complexity, which Sprague says kind of adheres to standard underwriting of a specific form of masculinity. Other folks in economics have said, we're turning out too many idiots upon skilled in technique, but innocent of real knowledge of economic issues. So I'd like to see economics in particular turn back to embracing descriptive models. And I know other disciplines are better at this. So again, I'm really curious to kind of hear your thoughts. One of the last things I want to really focus on is how, in particular, kind of in mainstream gender economics, there's really been this obsession with illustrating gender difference in economic behavior or outcomes. And oftentimes when that happens, there's not a lot of deep investigation of things like power or patriarchy, right? We're just kind of showing a difference and moving on, this like add gender and stir approach. Um, there's really great work by Julie Nelson that interrogates this specific issue in the context of gender differences, quote unquote, in risk taking. And Nelson talks about several things, right? She talks about how she does all these like meta-analyses where she takes a bunch of studies that say that there are gender differences in risk-taking propensities. And she, first of all, just shows that like statistically this isn't really true. And she shows this by using measures like Cohen's d and also the index of similarity. But she also shows that, right, and using these measures, right, she's showing that even if there's like a statistically significant difference, the degree of overlap might actually be quite considerable to the point where maybe it doesn't make sense to talk about difference as being statistically significant. And she says instead of difference, right, similarity seems to be a more prominent pattern. But even in addition to doing these tests for difference, right, she kind of raises questions about academic publishing, right, where there's kind of this push to publish some type of statistically significant gender difference, and maybe you won't get published if you don't find a specific difference, and you in fact find no meaningful difference. So that's something I like about her work. She also kind of highlights, what do we mean when we talk about measures of risk aversion? And usually in economics, that means something to do with like finance. But you could also think about, it's extremely risky, for instance, to be pregnant and give birth, right? That's a really risky undertaking. It is not health neutral. It's very risky, for instance, to be a stay-at-home parent, right, and have a lot of reliance on a partner or somebody else. And so, I think there's of course some bias in the measurement, but the main methods I wanted to point us to here are the Cohen's d and the index of similarity, and thinking about how we can use those to test for meaningful difference. Um, so kind of to wrap up the main things that I was thinking about when I was writing this paper, again, it's about kind of the data cleaning, different alternative measures of gender compared to just, again, that binary male-female that many of us get when we're using secondary data. Thinking about like studying up when we're thinking about our choice of comparison groups. Weighing kind of the trade-offs of different types of models that we might use for understanding intersectionality better. Being cautious, right, of these claims of causality and exogeneity and the Oaxaca blinder methods. Reconsidering techniques that kind of obfuscate theory. So again, kind of those principal component analyses, black box models. And again, thinking really seriously about like when is it appropriate to test for meaningful difference, and why are we doing it? And if we are doing it, is it even empirically robust? And should we use this index of similarity or Cohen's d? Some other things I will just conclude with. I think there's a big role for us as like quantitative researchers to push for improvements in quantitative data collection, even if we're not doing that collection ourselves. I think it's useful to kind of like write and think and talk about are the questions in the secondary data that I'm using worded in like bias, masculine, racist, classist, heteronormative ways? What are the options that my respondents are given, and how are the questions asked? One example I often think about here is the National Crime and Victimization Survey in the US, which I was very excited to be a participant of once, or a respondent rather. And they came to my house and they knocked on my door and they asked me some questions about my experiences with, crime. One of the questions they asked was if I'd experienced domestic abuse. And they asked this like with my partner, like standing in the living room, which like, luckily I'm not in this boat, but that seems like a really poor survey technique, right? To come into people's homes and ask them this question. And so like raising some concerns about that, and even thinking about like investigating those data based on if people spoke over the phone or in person. How do those responses perhaps differ? I mean, that's in my mind, a worthwhile pursuit in terms of quantitative research. And like I said at the beginning, I think this work is I'm raising a lot of questions. I'm kind of just throwing things at the wall to see what sticks and see what other people think about them because um, part of the reason I wrote this was that, I'm starting to do more work in my career and I was doing more quantitative work and I wanted to be really like cognizant of what I was doing and why I was doing it. And so I would love some kind of feedback and thoughts uh and also kind of I'm excited to see like all these the work that this group is doing, but also others and thinking about how are these questions about feminist approaches and quantitative data and quantitative research going to change now that we're seeing, artificial intelligence on the rise and big data? How do we think about algorithmic fairness and algorithmic bias? A lot of work that goes on in my department has to do with Bayesian econometrics. So this is kind of another thing I'm interested in is thinking about are there characteristics of Bayesian approaches that could be useful for feminists or not useful for feminists? Um, but broadly, I'm just kind of curious to go back to that quote from the very beginning, right? If feminist kind of econometrics is not really any different from like mainstream econometrics, what are we doing? Are we doing anything wrong? Should we be doing anything differently? And really, what's this kind of distinctly feminist approach to econometrics and to quantitative work um, more broadly? So I'm so excited to kind of be part of this conversation today, and I'm really looking forward to hearing what everyone has to say. So maybe I'll stop there and say thanks so much.